Well, now it's my turn, and after hearing all of that, some days I wonder how I get out of bed and work on air service development every day, because it sounds so sad, right? But I'm going to say some things that don't seem terribly optimistic, but I think there's reason for optimism, and the reason that I say that is because we're proof of that. So Sixel Consulting Group represents, and I'm trying to find an exception, at least one airport in every one of the states that's represented here. So we know your states. We work for your airports directly on air service development or on marketing current service. And we know those challenges. And despite that, our firm in the last 10 years has recruited 145 new routes. We've done that through broad community outreach and getting everybody on board towards the same goal, a lot of the things that Rebecca talked about. I've got my notebook here because before I get into these slides, I wanted to drop a bunch of business cards from JetBlue, but
I'll take them all.
Yeah. But I wanted to make sure I got the quote right, because I agreed completely with what Rebecca said at the very beginning of her presentation, which was, you can't make airlines come to your community. That is 100% true. You cannot make them come to your community. What you can do is move yourself up on their list of opportunities. And that's kind of what we focus on a daily basis, because so much capacity has been pulled out of our national aviation system. So we talked about 100 million seats. There are so many good opportunities for new flying or for more profitable flying that it is a matter of pulling communities and states and regions together to move up the list to the top of the list, so when the next aircraft or the next crew becomes available, we are the market that gets the service. That's the key. So, having said that, let's talk about why community support matters. And you're going to see some things that are similar to what you've seen before, and maybe just a slightly different way of explaining it. I'm a former journalist, so I'm all about dumbing it down and making it as clear as possible, and I think that works in a lot of our communities too. So this is my NCAA Tournament of the Airlines. I came up with this in March, right before the Final Four. So we're down to the Final Four. This is the same slide that Rebecca showed. But this goes back to deregulation, 1978,
That's awesome.
when we had over 20 major carriers in the country. And today we've got the 4 big ones that have 86% of our U.S. domestic capacity. Again, there are airlines like Alaska and Virgin America and JetBlue and Spirit that aren't represented, but they're so small compared to the big 4 now. And because there are only 4, there is limited competition that has resulted in increased fares and less service. Now, some of that is actually really good for your communities. So fares were unsustainably low in 2006 and 2007. Every airline was suffering from fares that were not sustainable and by flying things that were not profitable. All of the unprofitable routes that were being flown were squeezed out of the system. And so we were left with a very efficient system that makes money. We were also left with a lot of routes that were lost that would be profitable now. And that's where the optimism comes in. Smaller airports, of course, have faced the brunt of the cuts. And I'm sure all of you have seen that in your states. And we saw the map of all those airports that had lost at least 10% of their seats, and I swear that's a map of our clients. I think it's the exact same map. So in non-hub, the smallest of the markets, flights are down 43% and seats are down 31% if we go back to 2007, before the recession. After 2001, we saw basically, the airline industry got a close shave. So the top stuff that wasn't working, that was all removed. After 2008, we cut down to the bone. And all that was left was the bare bones of the aviation system. Now it's coming back. So airlines are also, as we talked about, cutting their costs by upgauging. We talk about upgauging as a way to reduce the number of crews that are needed. But the primary factor behind it becomes the fact that you can reduce your overall cost of operation and your cost per seat by offering more seats on an aircraft that costs about the same to operate. So we've seen the domestic aircraft size rise from about 95 seats to 107 seats. We have seen the 50-seat jet and smaller routes cut by 34%, while larger aircraft have come into the system. This is good for a lot of our airports. In a market like Boise, this is great because we're seeing more of the E-175 instead of the CRJ-200. So our top-level business travelers are getting a mainline experience. This is really tough in the smallest of our markets because often it does result in the loss of air service, as we've seen. But overall, when you take an E-175, it costs about, 10% more to operate than a CRJ-200, but you get 26 more seats. This is the formula for long-term profitability in most of our regional markets. So this is a positive thing that's happening, and for the consumer it's positive because the fares can start coming down, more seats are available, and better products are available. So all business models that the airlines employ in our country are making money right now. You have to go back to basically deregulation to find the last time that happened. Sure, we've had some good periods, but not every airline has been making money. Look at that chart. Every airline right now, all of our big airlines are making money. You look at the big four, and you've got Southwest, their margin leading, but their margin still lags behind Alaska and Allegiant. So what we have is a sustainable system that is built to handle the unexpected, which we never had before. What we had was a reactionary system that was built for the good times, and when something bad happened, we had freak out. And when freak out happens, we all lose air service. Now we have a system that's built to withstand fuel prices going up or something bad happening. Now the cyclical economy has really hurt airline profitability over time. So this goes all the way back to 1948, which is the farthest back we could find financial records, and it plots out airline profit or loss for all of the airlines in the United States each year since 1948. So if you're below the line, that's bad. But what it means is since 1948, collectively, if we add up all the numbers, airlines are still down $4.8 billion. That's after the profits we've seen for the last 5 years. We're still down $4.8 billion. This was a bad way to gamble. You'd be much better off to go and bet on 36 on roulette or even 00, and you'd have a much better chance of making money than the airlines have since 1948. The longest profitable stretch the airlines have ever had was 6 years. Now, we're in a 5-year stretch right now where we're seeing record profits for a number of our carriers, so it's highly likely that we break that because the airlines have found this sustainable model now. Fuel, of course, has a huge impact on profit margin. What people ask me all the time is, are the profits that the airlines are seeing now artificially inflated because fuel is where it is? And yes, they're artificially inflated. That's true. They're higher than they would be. But even with fuel at $3 a gallon, the airlines would all still be profitable, but their margins would be under double digits where they are now. So instead of billions, it would be hundreds of millions that they would be making on a quarterly basis. So our fuel is back down to $1.50 a gallon for the carriers. That's good news, but the carriers have planned for fuel to be up at $3 a gallon. So even if fuel goes to basically double where it is right now, and there are no indications if you look at the market that that's going to happen. We saw a slight increase in fuel prices over the last week, but it was less than 10%. That we do expect fuel prices to stay between $1.50 and say $2.50 over the next 2 to 3 years. Yet the airlines are prepared for higher fuel prices. Now what that means is that we still have the conservative philosophy in route planning. And this comes down again to what Rebecca said at the very beginning. You can't make an airline come to your market. That's because the airlines are saying we can't get into the same mistakes that we had before. Finally, we have airlines that have a memory, which is actually good for the industry, although it may be bad for some of our more marginal cases. But what they're saying is we don't want to overexpand and go into markets that are real risky, right now until we truly understand what our long-term cost prognostication will be. But there are many, many markets that do make sense in networks as airlines grow. And it's about moving up that list, as I mentioned before. So even with low fuel prices, margins for carriers are very tight. So this is just a 50-seat RJ. The red seats you see there are the ones the average airline has to sell in order to break even. So you got to sell 36 of your 50 seats just to cover the cost of your operation. So that's why high load factors really are important, depending on where your fare is. Now, what Rebecca says about driving a higher fare and not worrying about that, that's absolutely true, because more than anything, it's the yield that matters and not so much the load factor. But on average, only 6 seats on a 50-seat RJ are representing profit for a carrier. So while we see these massive billion-dollar profits, it's still a razor-thin margin on a flight-by-flight basis. This also explains why, when you have limited assets, because you have limited crews, it's very important that the airline allocate that airplane correctly. But again, that's opportunity, because maybe your opportunity to allocate the airplane is better than what that airplane is doing right now. And I think it's okay to look at things that way. So 71% load factor at the current fare level in the United States is your break-even load factor. People always ask me, well, how many seats do you need to sell for this service to be successful, especially when we're starting a new route? And I say, I don't know. And they say, how can you not know? You're a consultant. I said, because I don't know where the fare is going to come in. If I assume an average fare, you need 71% of your seats sold to break even. So communities have to mitigate risk in order to move up the list. You are not going to get an airline to come in to a market that has no underlying business case. Period. It doesn't matter how much money you raise. You can raise $10 million. If there's no market, it's not going to happen. That's why it's important that everything is analyzed on hard data and you understand where your opportunities lie before you go down any particular route. You have to understand where the demand is, where that demand can be profitable long term, and it's your goal to move yourself up the list and to mitigate risk at the beginning of the service when you're still getting people used to using it. So having said that, capacity discipline is king. The Big Four have all said they'll grow less than 3% per year, and that 3% growth, keep in mind, that's available seat miles. That's not total seats. That's seat miles. So Delta adds a flight from Seattle to Hong Kong. That could soak up 1.5% of their entire annual growth because that flight is so long. It's so many seat miles. So when we hear 3%, you think, oh, 3% more flying, that's 500 more flights a year. No, it could be 300 flights and they could all be going to Hong Kong from one market. So it's more competitive than it's ever been. And routes, of course, are a major investment. I want to talk about a project that we're currently working on in Tucson, Arizona. Tucson was not favorably compared to Boise, you saw in the per capita statistics, unfortunately. It's a really nice place. You all should visit. So the big demand in Tucson is for service to the East Coast, to New York City. And so we know there is a huge demand for this market because New York generates more tourists to Tucson than any other market in the country. So we know there are plenty of passengers, and we know the fares are really high, and we know it's going to be a success. But it's a huge investment. So it's almost $23,000 each way for an airline to fly a mainline jet between Tucson and New York City. So it's $16 million a year. That's the investment an airline's going to have to make. And so what we know we have to do to move up the list, knowing that we have a market that can be profitable, is we have to develop risk mitigation. And so what we did is we went to several carriers and we said, what do you forecast this market to do in its first 2 years of service? And they came back to us with numbers that were almost all the same, 3 different carriers. So we went to the business community and we said, New York service isn't going to happen on its own. This is on your shoulders. If you want this to happen, here's what you have to do. We need to raise $3 million. We need to have it in the bank, and it needs to be a revenue guarantee for the first 2 years of service in case they lose money. In 2 months, we had $2.98 million sitting in the bank. 2 months. Resorts, local businesses, Visit Tucson. No single contributor put in more than $250,000 though. So we have a broad coalition. There are over 200 people that have put in money. This is money they don't necessarily ever get back. If the route loses money, we lose all that. But they all have such demand for this service that they've all put it in the bank. We have since met with carriers, and we do expect by next spring to be announcing service. So that's the kind of commitment it takes to move up the list. Tucson, New York is going to take some carrier about 0.2% of their ASM growth for that year. So we're soaking up a large percentage of airline growth. But because we have a broad coalition that's perhaps more impressive than the amount of money, it's the sheer number of contributors, it makes that route that much more attractive to several carriers that could fly it. Moreover, it changes consumer behavior because we all know we like to fly with our frequent flyer benefits. I am a much maligned United top tier 1K. I'm an Alaska top tier. I'm loyal to those guys. I want to put my miles on those carriers. So if a new route comes in and it's JetBlue, how do you get me over there? Well, if I've got $25,000 sitting in the bank saying I'm backing up the performance of the flight, I'm probably pretty likely to use that flight. Corporate contracts are important, and then always communicating, and that's where marketing comes in, and that's why we're media partners here with NASAO too, with my colleague Alex Lynch back there. We believe in telling the story. You got to tell the story about why your airport is better than the big one down the road. And so with that, I will wrap up and we'll take questions, and thank you so much for having us here. And if Alex has been bothering you with his camera all week, I definitely apologize for that, but I can promise the video will be worth it. So thank you very much.